Can somebody let me know they can hear me talk and see the slides? I would appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you very much. A couple of announcements. If you don't already know, I made an announcement yesterday, but the grades are posted. 6-point curve on the grades. I think we had, on the first exam, I think we had 1 C and the rest of them were A's and B's, which is what you would expect. A lot of confusion. Most people lost points on the short answer questions. You know, saying water is a wonderful compound is not very good for maximizing points. And on the DNA RNA question, everybody forgot there were 3 types of RNA. You know, there's messenger RNA, transfer RNA, and ribosomal RNA. And so there were a lot of little things. Actually, those weren't little things. Remember, short answer question can, encompass more than one chapter or more than one section. Okay, some of them are general questions. Some of them are more specific questions. None of them were really hard. All of them we covered. And so, I mean, if you wrote anything, obviously you got at least 1 point or 2 points. But a lot of the things you lost out 1 point or 2. But like I say, there was a 6-point curve. And most everybody ended up with an A or B. I'm still having the problem, 2 problems. I'm still having the problem that you don't, in the subject line, I don't care what your name is, I don't care what you're writing me about, in the subject line, I want to know what class you're in, okay? I want to know if you're in BSC 2085, the morning class, BSC 2085, the afternoon class, BSC 2086, okay? That helps me out a whole lot. Then you can put your name, then you, in the subject matter, then you can put your name when you get to the body of the message, then you can put what you're writing about, okay? That helps me out a whole lot. And then a last little quirk thing. I try to answer all my emails within 24 hours. Most of the time, I answer the same day. Most of the time, especially if you put it on Outlook. Now, if you put it on Canvas, like I told you before, I have the Canvas app, but there's no thing that pops up tells me I has an email, so I have to periodically look at it when I remember to look at it. Outlook, obviously, it pops up if I have an email. If I answer you right back and expect something from you, or I'm trying to help you, and you don't answer me for 48, 72 hours or a week, then I am very reluctant to try to extend help to you again. I hope everybody understands that. If I answer you right back and you have a problem, and I ask you for something to try to resolve the problem, and I don't hear back from you for 24, 48, 72, or maybe a week, or maybe I don't hear back from you, okay? Then it makes me very reluctant to want to try to help you again. So, and you just have to remember that. You have to remember that not only for me, but for everybody else. Everybody here at school is trying to help you. I know you're very busy. I'm very busy. Probably not as busy as you, but I'm very busy, but I do try to respond back to my emails. And if you're having a problem, I try to help you, because my whole goal is for everybody to get an A or B. But if you don't want to respond back to me, that's fine. I am just telling you that's a little quirk I have, and a little quirk a number of other people have, that we do expect a response back. So it's your obligation to check your email twice a day, morning and evening. And if one of your professors has responded to you and asked for you something back, it would behoove you, okay, to respond back with them, saying, hey, I don't have it, I'll get it in 24 hours, or I'll do something. But that's very important from a business aspect, that you respond back. I'll continue grading stuff. I'm grading the other classes test today, and then I've got the 2086 test to grade, but I'll continue to add and grade stuff. We're going to start, as you can see, for the next 2 weeks, we're going to go over chapter 6, 7, and 8. They're sort of interconnected. Chapter 6 is sort of the basic anatomy and physiology of bones. Chapter 7 is the actual bones and the name of those bones And we will do that in the lab. We will talk about the axial lab today and look at videos, and I will tell you how the lab practical is going to differ from the last lab practical you took, and what you need to do to get ready for this lab practical. And then the last chapter is on joints, and we don't cover joints in very much detail. And so, you know, there's probably two, maybe three lecture hours of material here. And so we may end up having a day off next week like we did last time to catch up on your work, but that's okay with the skeletal system. So we cover 3 chapters, and because we don't cover joints in such detail, we may end up having another day off from the lecture system like we did last week, I believe. We're going to start talking about the skeletal system. We're going to talk about it, you know, a little while, and then we're going to go over and talk about the lab practical, which is the major thing. The major lab for these 3 chapters is lab practical on the bones, which is the same thing. If you were in a face-to-face meeting, we would be going over one lab section would be the axial skeleton, one lab section would be the appendicular skeleton, and then the next lab session would be a practical. So the skeletal system, there's a number of functions as you can imagine. The first is support. We've got to have something that provides a framework, okay? Protection, when we look at the skull today, we'll see it protects the brain, okay? The vertebral column protects the spinal cord. The chest protects a number of organs, as does the pelvis, okay? It also provides a point of attachment for muscles so that we can have movement. And then finally, primarily mineral storage of calcium and phosphorus, but there are other things stored in the bones, okay? So these are big things. Number one, we have to provide support. You know, we can have internal support, we can have an internal skeleton, or some insects have exoskeletons, okay? So we can have internal skeleton or external skeleton. Protection is very important, especially with the brain and the thoracic and the contents of the thoracic cavity. And as you can see, we have to have an attachment. Remember, a ligament attaches a muscle to a bone, a tendon attaches a ligament attaches a bone to a bone, a tendon attaches a muscle to a bone. I had a senior moment there. You'll have those, don't worry, it's coming, okay? Finally, hematopoiesis, we have production of our white blood cells in different areas. If you're gonna have a bone marrow aspiration, if they're trying to do a diagnosis, or you're trying to donate bone marrow to somebody, it's usually taken from the pelvic area. A bone marrow aspiration can also be taken from the sternum. Bones store fat, especially some of the long bones, and we have some hormone production performed by some of the bones. Osteocalcin regulates bone formation, and some obesity and some glucose intolerance. We're not going to get into the hormones very much. We have an endocrine chapter, chapter 16, which will be our last chapter, which we'll discuss. Classification of bones, okay? First, we have the major classification. Remember, all these are just artificial classifications. Nothing in the human body came with a name or with a classification. So they divide the skeleton up into 2 major systems, and it doesn't matter if you took A and P in high school, it's still talk about axial skeleton, appendicular skeleton. You take it here, you take it University of Florida, that's just a major category. It includes the cranium, the vertebral column, and the ribs. The cranium has a lot of structures in it, okay, has a lot of structures in it. Vertebral column is easy, and the ribs and the sternum are easy, okay? Not very many structures, they're easy to learn. But the skull has a lot of structures to it, and you'll spend some time on the skull. And then the appendicular skeleton is literally everything else, okay? If it's not the head, the vertebral column, or the thoracic cage, then it's in the appendicular skeleton. Shapes of bones, these are just classifications, okay? Long bones are bones that are longer than they are wide, okay? Long bones are bones that are longer than they are wide. They usually have a shaft and usually have 2 ends. And as you can imagine, it's mostly the limb bones, the humerus, okay, radius and ulna, The femur, okay, the tibia and the fibula are long bones, okay? Named for their shape, not for their size, okay? You can have a long bone, okay? The sternum's a long bone, okay? It's longer than it is wide. The sternum's a long bone. Short bones are cube shaped. So here's a short bone, it's a cube shape. So the ankle bones and the wrist bones, ankle bones and wrist bones, ankle bones and wrist bones are short bones or cuboid bones. Then there's also some sesamoid bones formed within the tendons, okay? Remember, these are just artificial classifications, okay? Flat bones, thin and flat and usually curved. The sternum is a flat bone, okay? The sternum is a flat bone. It also is a long bone, okay? Ribs are flat bones. Skull is a flat bone, okay? So these are flat bones. And then finally, irregular bones. So that's almost like connective tissue, not quite like connective tissue. But if it's not a long bone, not a flat bone, not a short bone, then it's an irregular bone. And the classic example is a vertebra. This is a vertebra right here. So that is just an artificial thing. I will never ask you if it's a long bone, a flat bone, a cuboid bone, or irregular bone. It's just a classification. We superficially looked at compact bone, okay? We superficially looked at compact bone when we did our tissues. Don't forget that the tissue lab practical is due today at 11:55, okay? Tissue practical is due today at 11:55. It exhibits osteons, which are the basic functional system of compact bone. And there still is a hangover, a Haversian system. I'm sure some person named Haversian named this, okay? And so this is our compact bone here, okay? This is compact bone. It's usually on the outside. It's usually on the outside of bones, okay? And then the interior bone will have spongy bone, okay? So this is an osteon. This is an osteon or Haversian system. This is an osteon. So each one of these major round circles that has its own blood vessels with it is an osteon. The canal inside is called the central canal or Haversian canal, okay? It contains an artery, a vein, and a nerve. Here's an example of an osteon. The concentric bone laid down is called the lamella. The concentric bone laid down is called the lamella here. Concentric bone laid down is called the lamella. On the outside of bones is periosteum, okay? On the outside of bones is periosteum. Periosteum carries with it some of the blood vessels. On the outside of the bone is periosteum. They are blood vessels in the periosteum, so they are perforating fibers that go from these blood vessels into the bone, okay? They are perforating fibers. These are called Sharpey's fibers, okay? Sharpey's fibers are perforating fibers. Still the whole over with somebody's name attached to it, okay? We have endosteum. So periosteum is the outermost layer. Endosteum is the innermost layer, okay? Endosteum is the innermost layer, and that covers all these spicules of spongy bone. And then we have perforating vessels from the Haversian system, nerve, artery, and vein, that are going to go into the spongy bone, and they are called the perforating canal. The canal where these vessels go through is called the perforating canal or the Haversian canal, okay? So this is the lamella, this is the central canal, this is the nerve, artery, and vein here. These are the osteocytes that live in lacuna, okay? These are the osteocytes that live in the lacuna. And the little vessels that supply them with nutrients are, the canals there are called canaliculi, okay? Remember, the osteocytes wall themselves in. The osteocytes wall themselves in, but they still need nourishment, okay, because they're living cells, okay? So we have these little canals called canaliculi that supply them with nourishment. So I told you we were going to look at this in a little more detail when we got to the bone, and we will. We have two types of bone. We have compact bone, okay, which we saw here. This is compact bone. And then we have spongy bone, and that's spongy bone there. So we have compact bone, which exhibits osteons, which are also called Haversian systems, and spongy bone, which contains no osteons, but rather has an irregular lattice work of bony matrix. So this is spongy bone here. Spongy bone and compact bone. Compact bone, spongy bone. And so most long bones and a lot of the flat bones have a layer of compact bone, okay, and a layer of spongy bone. Here is an example of the skull. Okay, here's an example of the skull. Notice we have an outer table and an inner table of compact bone and a middle area of spongy bone. Okay, we have an outer table and inner table. So sometimes you'll hear a skull fracture say that it went through the outer table but did not go through the inner table. What that means is there's a fracture here and this compact bone down into the spongy bone, okay, down into the spongy bone, but there was no fracture of the inner table. That does not mean anything in regards to brain injury because the brain could still suffer a severe contusion. You could still have blood vessel rupture and have a hematoma, okay? So just because it didn't go through the inner table, okay, which is sometimes what they call this. So this is flat bone here. This is flat bone. This is the skull. But you can see there's a layer of compact bone, a layer of compact bone, and this would be the spongy bone. And this is what the spongy bone looks like. It has a trabecular pattern, okay? Anatomy of a typical long bone, okay? Long bones, humerus, femur, okay? Typical long bones, they have a shaft, okay? They have a shaft, and the shaft is called the diathesis, okay? And it's composed of hollow, compact bone. So this is the shaft here. This is the shaft here. It has a shaft and two ends, okay? So it has a shaft here. This is the diaphysis. It's the shaft. It's composed of hollow, compact bone. So this is compact bone here with a space in here. And we're going to have something in that space, okay? But the diaphysis, which is a shaft of the long bone, goes from this end here to this, for the termination of this end, down to the termination of this end, okay? That's the diaphysis. And it has compact bone, just like when we looked at the skull, okay? It has compact bone on the outside, okay? And with a cavity in here. The epiphyses are the ends of the bone. We have a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis. We have a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis. Proximal is the one closest to the joint. Distal is the one furthest away from the joint, okay? So if this is the humerus, this would be where it would articulate. It would articulate in the glenoid cavity, in other words, with the scapula at the shoulder, okay? So this is the proximal epiphysis. This is the distal epiphysis. The epiphysis has compact bone on the outside and spongy bone on the inside. The epiphysis is the end of the bone. We have two ends. We have a proximal end and a distal end. We have compact bone, which has osteons, the Herbertian systems that we looked at, on both ends, okay? And it also has this spiculated spongy bone here. This is the spongy bone. So it has spongy bone on the inside. We have, in the long bone, we have a medullary or marrow cavity. We can either have red blood cell production in here, or we can have yellow marrow, which is fat. So in the long bones, okay, in the long bones, we can have fat, okay, in those areas, or we can have areas of red blood cell production. So in that cavity we talked about in the long bones, we can either have fat here, or we can have blood cell production, okay? Those are the two things that occur in the marrow cavity of the long bones. Just as a little clinical feature, if you have a femur fracture, okay, if you have a femur fracture, you can, and the femur's fractured, obviously you have blood vessels fractured around the bone because you have fat in the cavity there. You have the possibility of fat emboli. You have the possibility of fat emboli. So you always need to keep that in your differential diagnosis. If you have somebody that comes in with a femur fracture and all of a sudden, you know, you measure their hemoglobin hematocrit, they're stable there, they got a femur fracture, they start getting a little bit short of breath, it could be from the fact that they're having fat emboli. Okay, so that's just a little thing to put in your differential diagnosis. Differential diagnosis is what's causing their shortness of breath. That they have enough of the red blood cells? Are they circulating? Is the heart doing fine? Or is the lungs doing fine? Okay. Do they have a pulmonary embolus or do they have a fat embolus? So that's what differential diagnosis when you're trying to figure out what's causing their problem. Okay. We have membranes. Okay, we have an endosteum, which covers the internal surfaces of the bone and lines the canals and lines the trabecula. So the endosteum would be covering this marrow cavity on the inside. The endosteum would be covering this marrow cavity on the inside. It would also extend through all the canals. Okay, it would also extend through Volkmann's canal and Charpet's canal with Charpet fibers where they're going through the periosteum down into the bone. Okay. And all those trabeculi in the spongy bone would have endosteum covering them, okay? All the trabeculi in the spongy bone would have endosteum covering them. So everything on the internal surface, whether it's regular or irregular, is covered by endosteum, and the canals that serve an essential function in the bone for transportation of oxygen, removal of carbon dioxide, transportation of food materials and removal of waste, they are aligned with endosteum also. We also have a periosteum that covers the diaphysis of the bone. So of the long bone, we have a periosteum that covers the diaphysis except for the joint surfaces, because the joint surfaces have a different kind of connective tissue that covers them, okay? They have a different kind of connective tissue because in the diaphysis, we're not going to have one bone rubbing on the other bone, okay? But think about the knee joint, okay? We have the distal, okay? We have the distal epiphysis rubbing against the proximal, distal epiphysis of the femur rubbing against the proximal epiphysis of the tibia, okay? And so we're going to need a very strong type of connective tissue that's going to be able to withstand a lot of movement, okay? A lot of movement. Because the periosteum covers or contains blood vessels, if you're doing a fracture, say you're setting a fracture and you're putting in a plate or something like that, or putting in screws, you want to remove as much periosteum as you need to be able to perform your fixation procedure, but you don't want to remove an excess of periosteum because you have blood vessels. Granted, you have more blood vessels inside, but a lot of those are disrupted if you have a fracture. Okay, a lot of those are disrupted if you have a fracture. So remember, periosteum is very important. So you want to take whatever you need out as you need it, okay, but you don't want to take any extra because we do have blood vessels coming through there. Okay, and then we have articular cartilage. Okay, that's the cartilage we're talking about, that articular cartilage. Okay, that covers outside of the epiphysis and it cushions the bone during the movement. So this would be articular cartilage. Okay, that covers the outside of the epiphysis. Remember, the outside of the diaphysis is covered by periosteum. The outside of the epiphysis, the proximal and distal epiphysis, is covered by articular cartilage, okay? We have an epiphyseal line here. This is the epiphyseal line. It's a faint line you can see on x-ray in long bones. This is where the growth of the bone occurred. This is where the growth of the bone occurs, okay? If you're an adult and you have a fracture through this area, it's not of a major concern because your epiphyseal plate is now a epiphyseal line, and you know you've been through your growth spurts and you no longer have growth going on. However, if you have a fracture, through this epiphyseal line, the epiphyseal plate, in a young individual that hasn't reached their growth spurt, then that is a more urgent type of consultation. You certainly need to get an orthopedist involved and maybe a pediatric orthopedist involved, okay? Because a fracture through the epiphyseal plate, if it's not, if it's a crush injury all bets are off, okay? But if it's not a crush injury, it needs to be lined up and placed back into as good of approximation as possible. Because you can imagine if you get injury to the epiphyseal plate, okay, and then you undergo a growth spurt, okay? You undergo a growth spurt, and say that individual grows 5 inches, and you have one side, one femur that literally is not going to grow, okay, or maybe grows 1 inch, and the other side grows 5 inches. All of a sudden, you have a 4-inch leg length discrepancy, okay, which is a major problem. So in a younger individual whose epiphyseal plate has not fused, okay, and become an epiphyseal line, then a fracture through this epiphyseal plate is a big to-do. A fracture through this epiphyseal plate is a big to-do, requires orthopedic consultation, may require, and depends on what the orthopedist wants to do, it may require pediatric orthopedist consultation, and they need to be involved in the care and management of that fracture to try to avoid any kind of growth discrepancies. I mean, it could just be 1 inch, but that's still a big deal. A 1 inch leg length discrepancy is still a big deal because you're either going to have some kind of lengthening surgery, okay, or you're going to have to wear some kind of lift, some kind of additional pad in one of your shoes for a leg length discrepancy. So remember that this epiphyseal line, okay, represents the epiphyseal plate, and the epiphyseal plate is where the growth occurs. Okay, it doesn't occur down here in the diaphysis. It occurs in the epiphyseal line. Okay, growth occurs here and pushes the epiphysis away from the diaphysis, and new bone is laid down. Cells and organization. We have an osteogenic cell. Okay, we have, in other words, we have a precursor cell. Okay, we have a precursor cell. We then have an osteoblast, which is a matrix synthesizing, okay, cell, which is responsible for bone growth. So we have an osteoblast, which is responsible for the bone growth. We have an osteocyte, okay, which is located in lacuna, which is responsible for bone maintenance, okay, bone maintenance. And then we have an osteoclast right here. This is the last type of cell, which is responsible for bone reorganization and bone breakdown. Say you had a fracture of the bone, okay, and you had bone fragments in there and non-viable bone, the osteoclast would come in there and clean that up, and then the osteoblast would be responsible for laying down new bone, and then the osteocyte would be responsible for maintenance of that bone. Lamella are concentric layers laid down in opposite directions. They remind me of tree rings. So one will be laid down that direction, the one outside it be laid down in the opposite direction, okay? We have the Herbergian canals, which have the vessels. We have the lacuna, which have the osteocytes. Remember, the osteocytes are one of the 3 types of cells, not counting the blast cell or the precursor cell. We have a progenitor cell for everything, okay? And they live in the lacuna. They literally walled themselves into the lacuna, like that Vincent Price story. And so they live in the lacuna, and then we have these Volkmann's canals that allow vessels connect and nourish with the outer layers. So the Volkmann's canals are those canals that are coming in from the periosteum. They're coming in from the periosteum that, excuse me. These are the Volkmann's canal, I'm sorry. These are from the Herbergian system. These are Sharpe fibers. These are Volkmann's canals that are coming from these Herbergian systems, okay, that penetrate through the bone, that are going to provide nourishment to other parts of the bone, especially the spongy bone. Remember, the spongy bone doesn't have these Herbergian systems, so it's dependent on these Volkmann's, these perforating fibers from the Volkmann's canal, okay? Remember, this canal here is lined with endosteum, okay? And all the tubercular have endosteum there, okay? The Sharpe fibers, the fibers that perforate to the periosteum, which are responsible for providing nourishment to the outermost layers, the layers furthest away from the Herbergian systems. The canaliculi bring nutrients to the individual bone cells. We talked about that. Spongy bone has no osteons, trabecular framework of bone tissue. So there again, we look at the skull. Skull has compact bone and spongy bone, compact bone, compact bone, spongy bone, compact bone. No osteons, trabecular framework of bone tissue. This is a trabecular framework. This is trabecular. These are trabecula. So this is the framework of spongy bone. Okay. What does that do? Number one, okay, if the entire skull was compact bone, the weight of the skull would be a whole lot more. Okay, if the entire skull was compact bone, the weight of the skull would be a whole lot more because it would all be compact bone. So it adds an ability to still provide protection, but to decrease weight. In the long bones, it's also an area where blood cells are produced, and also a fat storage area. Matrix, okay? What's in the matrix of the bone? Hydroxyapatite is just calcium phosphate. Bone's primary storage is calcium phosphate. We have collagen there, okay? And we have proteins, carbohydrate complexes, which are called proteoglycans and glycoproteins, just to remember. The bone has a matrix, okay? We talked about the matrix in connective tissue, some of the matrices being gel-like, okay, and some of the matrices being hard, okay? This is an example of one of the harder matrices, and these are the materials contained within this matrix. Like I say, calcium and phosphorus are the two big storage materials in the bone. How is bone developed? We have two major ways that bone is developed, okay? Two major ways that it's developed. Intermembranous bone, where it's built from the inside out. Intermembranous bone, where it's built from the inside out. And so what you have bone here that has these little ossification centers. So you have fibrous connective tissue. Okay, you have fibrous connective tissue. You're going to have an ossification center. Okay, you're going to have an osteoblast coming in here and laying down osteoid. Okay, you're going to have osteoblast coming in here and laying down osteoid. So you had this big sheet of fibrous connective tissue, big sheet of fibrous connective tissue. You have a osteoblast coming in and laying down osteoid. Osteoid is that bony matrix, okay? It's that bony matrix. And you're going to get this bony matrix being laid down, osteoid secreted within the fibrous membrane and calcifies. The osteoblast begin to secrete osteoid, which is calcified. It traps the osteoblast. So the osteoblasts become osteocytes because now they are trapped. Now they are trapped in the osteoid. Now the osteoblasts, which are out here in the periphery, as they secrete osteoid, as they secrete the matrix, they become trapped inside that matrix, and they mature into osteocytes, okay? And then eventually you have these buds coming in, okay? These blood vessel buds coming in. And what's going to happen is these portions of osteoid, the portions of osteoid here are going to be resorbed, and you're going to get this trabeculations, okay? So bone calcifies radially, resulting in flat bone. These are skull bones and clavicles, okay? This is primarily, intermembranous bone formation is primarily the skull bones, okay? But it's also a little bit in the clavicles. You get this cavitation occurring, okay? And the cavitation is directed by and started by the blood vessels coming in here, okay? Blood vessels coming in here, and then that starts this, decalcification of this osteoid, so that you have compact bone here, and you end up with some spongy bone here, okay? And so that is intramembranous bone, okay? That's intramembranous bone, and that occurs from the clavicles upwards, okay? So in other words, the skull, okay, and the clavicles. So the clavicles upwards is intermembranous bone. Intermembranous bone is in a fibrous connective tissue layer, okay? It starts with ossification centers, okay? You have the osteoblast laying down osteoid. Osteoid traps the osteoblast. They become osteocytes. So you have an area of solid bone. You have blood vessels. You have blood vessels and blood vessel buds growing in, okay? they decalcify some of the areas in the innermost portion. They decalcify some of the areas in the innermost portion. The outer portions stay compact bone. The inner areas become spongy bone. So that's how you would have the skull with an area of compact bone, an area of spongy bone, and an area of compact bone. So that is intermembranous bone development. And the reason I keep emphasizing this, I can guarantee you with 100% certainty, this will be a short answer question. Give and explain in detail the two methods of bone formation. One of them is intermembranous bone formation, okay? And we just went through that. The second one is interchondral bone formation, okay, which uses a cartilage pattern, okay, uses a cartilage pattern. So we have hyaline cartilage here, okay? We have hyaline cartilage here. So this entire bone is made up of hyaline cartilage. We then have a bony collar formed here. Here's the bony collar being formed. And we have a primary ossification center in what is going to become the diaphysis. This is going to become the diaphysis. This is going to become the epiphysis. This is going to become the diaphysis, and this is going to become the epiphysis, okay? We start with a hyaline cartilage framework, okay? Remember, these are the bones literally below the clavicles, okay? Bone collar forms around the diaphysis. The primary ossification center forms in the middle of the hyaline cartilage shaft, okay? And you have something similar, okay? You have something similar that went on in the intermembranous bone formation. You're having osteoid laid down in here, okay? Then you have the periosteal bud, okay? You have the periosteal bud. So the cartilage in the center calcifies and then cavitates. The perichondrium, okay, becomes infiltrated with blood vessels. These blood vessels form this periosteal bud that invades the internal cavities, and the spongy bones begins to form. Remember, in the long bones, we have this central cavity, okay, and then we have in the diaphysis, we have a central cavity, and then we have compact bone on the outside. And the central cavity either has hemopoietic tissue responsible for production of blood cells, or it has fat. And in the epiphysis, we have compact bone. The epiphysis are the ends. Epiphysis are the ends of the bones, okay, the long bones. We have compact bone on the outside, and we have spongy bone on the inside. So we have our periosteal bud going in here, and that periosteal bud is going to start the cavitation, okay? And we're going to have spongy bone formed in here with a medullary cavity, a spongy bone. And then we're going to have, so our primary ossification center started in the diaphysis. The primary ossification center started in the diaphysis. Now we're going to have secondary ossification centers that are going to start in the epiphysis. Remember, the epiphysis are the ends of the bones, the ends of the long bones. We can have a proximal epiphysis, which is the one that is closest to the joint of interest, okay? So if this was going to be the humerus, this would be the one closest to the scapula, okay, because that would be our shoulder joint. That would be the joint of interest. And this would be the one that is further away. So this is the proximal epiphysis, and this is the distal epiphysis, okay? Now, if we're concerned about the elbow joint, okay, if we're concerned about the elbow joint, and we're looking at the radius and ulna, okay, we're looking at the radius and ulna, they would be different, okay? Second, because the radius would be right here, and it'd be the proximal epiphysis, because we were concerned with the elbow joint and the portion of the radius that articulates with the carpal bones. The wrist bones would be the distal epiphysis. So we have secondary ossification centers develop in the epiphysis. And then we have, which is also hyaline cartilage, okay? And so then we're going to have the same type of thing. We're going to have cavitate, we're going to have ossification here, and then we're going to have buds occurring from the blood vessels, growing in from the periosteum. We're going to have cavitation, and we're going to end up with compact bone on the outside and spongy bone on the inside. And we're going to end up with epiphyseal plates, both in the proximal and distal epiphysis, okay? And the growth is from the epiphyseal, from the diaphyseal side. So the growth occurs on this side and pushes the epiphysis away. Growth's going to occur on this side and pushes the epiphysis away. Growth's going to occur on this side and pushes the epiphysis away. And that's how your long bones grow. That's how your long bones grow from the epiphyseal plate, Remember, after we have our growth spurt, then that epiphyseal plate will fuse and become a line, and it'll be called the epiphyseal line, which if you get a good x-ray of one of the long bones, you can actually see the epiphyseal line in an older adult, and in a younger individual, you can see the epiphyseal plate. And like I say, it's very important if you're involved in the care of a young individual that may have a fracture through this epiphyseal plate, to make sure that they get the proper care to avoid any kind of limb discrepancies. If it was in the humerus, then you can have one arm longer than the other, okay? So this is our bone development. If we were looking for our bone development in our enochondral bone formation, which is essentially all the bones, okay? Not every bone, but just have it in your head. It's the bones below the clavicles, and the intermembranous formation is primarily in the skull and the clavicles, okay? Bone growth and remodeling, okay? We can add length, and we can add to the surface diameter. So we can add length at the epiphyseal plate is the way to add length. Once the epiphyseal plate has fused, we're not going to get any additional length, okay? We're not going to get additional length. So once somebody had epiphyseal plates have fused, doesn't matter what additional supplements you give them, they're not going to grow, okay? They're not going to grow in height, okay? We can add appositional surfaces to the bones, okay? And if you think about it, somebody who weighs 300, 400 pounds, okay, would have increased diameter of their weight supporting bones. They wouldn't have increased length, but it'd have increased diameter of those weight supporting bones, as opposed to somebody who weighs 150 pounds. Somebody who's very muscular or very fat. It doesn't really matter if you have an increased weight, or if that's something that would have increased use. And we're not talking about, typing or things like that. We're talking about somebody, like my dad was a blacksmith. If it had been measured, my guess is his right humerus would have been, and maybe even his radius and ulna would have been greater in diameter because of appositional adding to the surface diameter. Growth of long bones depends on this epiphyseal cartilage, also called the epiphyseal plate. If it's not there, then we're not going to have additional bone growth in length, okay? We can have appositional bone growth, but we're not going to have additional bone growth, okay? We have a number of zones, okay? For bone development, okay? We have a proliferation zone, cells in the epiphyseal plate facing the epiphysis divide and push it away from the diaphysis. So we're talking about, this is the epiphyseal plate. Okay? We have a proliferation zone, a hypertrophic zone, a calcification zone, and an ossification zone, okay? We have a proliferation zone. The proliferation zone is going to divide and push the epiphysis away from the diaphysis. So here's our epiphyseal plate. It's going to divide in this region and push the epiphysis away from the diaphysis, okay? We have a hypertrophic zone where the older chondrocytes, remember chondrocytes are the ones that lay down cartilage. These are hypertrophy, okay? These hypertrophy. Then we have a calcification zone. This is our calcification zone here, where the matrix starts calcifying, okay? And then we have an ossification zone, okay, Remember, this is the epiphysis was being pushed away. So this is in the diaphysis. So in the diaphysis, we're going to have compact bone on the outer surfaces. We're going to have compact bone on the outer surfaces, and we're going to have compact. Then we're going to have spongy bone. So we're going to have ossification. These are some of these spicule. We're going to have this central area carved out, and then there are also some of these areas are going to be ossified. Okay, so that's how lengthening occurs. Lengthening occurs in the proliferation zone. So this is the proliferation zone. Okay, this is the proliferation zone. It's going to push the epiphysis away from the diaphysis. So you're going to have proliferation, you're going to have hypertrophy, you're going to have calcification, and then ossification. Remodeling results when osteoclasts secrete digestive enzymes. Remember, we have osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. So you're going to need to know the three different cells. Osteoblasts lay down the matrix. Osteocytes maintain the matrix while living in the lacunae with the canaliculi, this little channels to supply them nourishment, okay? And then the osteoclasts are the ones for breaking down the bony matrix, okay? Requirements for ossification: you have to have vitamin D. It's required for absorption of the calcium. So you got to have vitamin D. You got to have growth hormone from the anterior pituitary, which controls the epiphyseal plates. You got to have growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. The Dr. Phillips, remembering what comes from the anterior pituitary and what comes from the posterior pituitary. There are only two things from the posterior pituitary: antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Everything else comes from the anterior pituitary if it comes from the pituitary. So that's the way I remember stuff. If they say, does this come from the anterior pituitary or posterior pituitary? If it's oxytocin or antidiuretic hormone works in the kidneys. Oxytocin is the one responsible for labor. If you've ever been pregnant and been induced, you have a Pitocin drip. Well, that's oxytocin, okay? And so you got uterine contractions, also responsible for the ejection of milk in if you're trying to breastfeed the infant, okay? But growth hormone comes from the anterior pituitary. It controls the epiphyseal plates. Thyroid hormone from the thyroid monitors the growth hormone to provide proper proportions. And sex hormones are the ones that create the growth plate spurt. And then after that, after they peak and then start going down, that's when the plates close, okay? So we have growth hormone from the anterior pituitary, thyroid hormone from the thyroid, okay, and sex hormones that either come from the ovaries or from the testes that are essential in controlling the effects of the epiphyseal plate, okay? We have to have calcium. If it's low, production of the parathyroid occurs and calcium is taken from the bone. If we have high calcium, okay, that would induce hydroxyapatite crystal formation along with phosphorus or phosphate, okay? Remember we talked about hydroxyapatite as being calcium phosphate and located in the matrix, okay? So if the calcium is low, the parathyroid is going to cause calcium to be mobilized from the bones. If the calcium is high, it's going to be placed into the bones in the form of hydroxyapatite, okay? Took me a long time to figure out how to pronounce that. That's hydroxyapatite, okay? That's calcium phosphate is what it is, okay? Stress of a prolonged load encourages the lay down bone for protection and stability. So that's what I was talking about, the person that weighs 300 or 400 pounds or the person that has prolonged stress on their bones. We have the laying down of bone on the outside of the bone. It doesn't increase the length of the bone, okay? It increases the width of the bone, okay? Fractures and repairs. We have a hematoma, okay? Blood vessels are torn and bleeding occurs into the area. Bone cells die due to no nutrition because when you have a fracture, you have disruption of the blood supply. We have fibrocartilage callus forms, okay? Capillaries grow back. Phagocytic cells, primarily the macrophage, monocyte macrophage, clean up the debris. Fibroblasts and osteoclasts begin restructuring process to bridge the gap. So you're going to have a cartilage laid down and then you're going to have osteoid laid down. So your first callus is just a cartilage callus, fibrous tissue and cartilage. You're having new blood vessels grow in. You're having all this debris cleared up, okay? Then you get bony callus formed, okay? New trabecular form and convert fibrocartilage callus. So you had cartilage laid down, okay? You had cartilage laid down, and then the cartilage is replaced with bone. And then the bone is remodeled, okay? The bony callus is reshaped and compact bone is laid down to restructure the walls. So these are the 4 steps in bone healing, okay? And this is just a schematic of that. Electricity encourages osteoblasts. If you have a fracture that has difficulty healing, then you can put electrical stimulation to try to get healing, okay? We have regular remodeling, okay? I am 70 years old, okay? So my entire skeleton has probably been replaced, it says, every 10 years, so 7 times, okay? If you are 20 years old, your entire skeleton is being replaced. So the osteoclasts come in, and obviously it's not the whole skeleton at one time, but the osteoclasts come in and break down a portion of your skeleton, and the osteoblasts come in and then lay down new bone, okay? And then osteocytes maintain that bone. So you have remodeling of your skeleton all the time. So we're gonna leave off with the types of breaks. This is about halfway in the lecture, so we're gonna leave off with this, and we're gonna go to the lab portion. We're gonna leave off this and go to the lab portion. Okay, the lab's gonna be a little bit different here, okay? Here's our instructions. These are 2 videos, okay? These are 2 videos. This guy's really good, okay? This guy's really good. This is primarily the axial skeleton, and then the second video is primarily the appendicular skeleton. They're not very long. They're probably 15 minutes long. This is 7 minutes long. I'm going to do the and this is 6 minutes long, okay? He does a great review. He does a great review. This is what you need to do, okay, for the lab modules, okay? This lab module will be timed, okay? There are 70 bony structures on your lab practical. If you were taking it face-to-face, it would be timed. There are 70 bony structures on your lab practical on slides. You will have 3 hours. You'll have 3 hours to do your lab practical. You will have 3 hours to do your lab practical. It won't be opened up till next week, so it won't coincide with the next test, okay? You'll have time after you finish the test to do lab practical or time before. What you need to do while you're watching the video is make you a word list, okay? Make you a word list. And I'll show you. I don't give you one on this, but I do on the muscles, and I do on the list of muscles here. See, the one I make is alphabetical. Okay, the one I made was alphabetical. This, if we were doing the muscle test face to face, you'd come in, you'd get an answer sheet and a word list. Okay, you get an answer sheet and a word list. You can do it one of 2 ways. You can do it alphabetical, or you can do it by bone. Okay, so if this is the way I would do it, if he's talking about the skull, then I'd have a big heading skull, and I'd make my word list, and those would be structures of the skull that I would need to know. These are the only things that you need to know for the lab practical. Okay, this is what the word list would look like if you came in for the face-to-face practical. It would just be all alphabetical. There wouldn't be any hints. It'd just be a bunch of alphabetical terms. Okay, let's go back here. So what you need to do, you can do it any way you want to. You can do it any way you want to. You know, you're still going to have your book. You're going to have your notes. All the slides are out of the book. This one is just going to be different in the fact that it is timed, okay? This one's going to be different in the fact that it is timed. Okay. So what you need to do as part of your lab is watch this video. Okay. This is on the axial skeleton. There will be no uh, requirements to know any additional terms except for what he mentions on the videos. Okay. Except for what he mentions on the videos. And like I say, you can make your word list however you want to. Okay. But the best thing, what I would suggest is I would suggest skull. When he talks about the clavicle, I'd say clavicle. When he talks about the sternum, I'd say sternum. When he talks about vertebra, I'd say vertebra. When he talks about the pelvis, I'd do pelvis. When he talks about humerus, I'd write humerus and write the structures underneath. It would be better than doing it alphabetically wise, okay? You're going to go through and you're going to watch both videos and make your word list however you want to do that, okay? However you want to do that. And then what you will do is whenever you're ready to take the exam, you can use your book, you can use slides, you can use whatever you want to, but this test is going to be timed. This test will be timed. You'll have 3 hours to do it. They are 70 bony structures. Usually on a slide, there's 2 or 3 things to pick out. And so on the slide, it might be a slide at the base of the skull, and there'll be 2 or 3 things to pick up. Might be a slide of the femur and 2 or 3 things. So there's not 70 slides, okay? There's only 20-something slides, so they must have 2 or 3 things each. Except some of them could have 4 because I know there's one slide that only has 1 bone, okay? That's a hyoid bone. The kickers, if you don't know the hyoid and patella, make sure you know what they look like by themselves, okay? But that's the difference in this. Number one, you're going to make your own word list. For the muscles, I'll give you a word list, and for the nervous system sensations, you'll have a word list. But for this, you make your own word list. Where do you need to make your word list from? You need to make it through these 2 videos. And like I say, 1 7 minutes, 1 6 minutes. You do it however you want to do it, in whatever order you want to do it. Okay. The lab practical will not open till next week. Okay. Lab practical will not open till next week. This is what you need to do for lab today whenever you decide to do the lab today. Okay. Because this is what we would be doing. You would come in. I would give you a list of terms that you should know from the axial skeleton. Okay. Starting with the skull and going down to the vertebra and going down to the sternum and going down to the ribs. Okay. And you'd have that list, and you'd sit there with your box, each table of 4 would sit there with a box of bones and go through that. Since we don't have the ability to do that, this is what I used last semester. It worked out well, and this is what I used this semester. Okay, so this is on the axial skeleton here, and this is on the appendicular skeleton. You don't have to do it today if you don't want to, but you need to do it sometime. Okay, and there will be no questions that ask on the lab practical, no questions that are asked on the lab practical that weren't asked here, okay, weren't asked here. The lab practical is worth 50 points. Lab practical is worth 50 points. There are 70 questions, okay? Every question after 50 counts a 1/4 point extra credit. Every question after 50 counts a 1/4 point extra credit. So you have the potential. Number one, that tells you just got to get 50 right to get the whole 50 points. Okay. So you just got to get 50 out of 70 right to get the whole 50 points. Extra credit for every one you get afterwards, you get a 1/4 point. So if you got 4 extra, you get 51. If you got all 20 extra, you get a total of 55. Okay. So I make it as fair as I can. So you got 70 questions, you got to get 50 right. The first 50 you get right, you get your whole 50 points for the lab practical. For every question you get right past 50, there's 20 additional questions. You get a 1/4 point extra credit. So the maximum you can get would be 55. Okay, so that's a fair way to do it. So everybody should be able to get 50 out of the 70 answers. Okay, and most people last semester were making 55, 54, 53. I mean, it was a rare person. I think the lowest score was 45. But most everybody was making at least 50, and they were in the extra credit because all you had to do is get 50 out of the 70 for your first 50 points, and then everything after that's extra credit. Okay. Are there any questions now? So on Wednesday, we'll probably finish up the lecture, okay? And then the following Monday, we will go through the lab. We'll just spend the time in the lab, go through the lab in more detail and talk about the lab, okay? And talk about the lab practical. I might even, sometimes I do this, and I'll probably do this, I might even just zip through the slides, just zip through them and just show you what they look like so you don't get all panicky about it, okay? So that's probably what we'll do. Finish up the lecture on Wednesday, talk about the lab on Monday, and then not have class next Thursday because we would have finished up the bones. But, excuse me, next Wednesday a week. All right, any questions for me? All right, then don't forget that all these, you already have lectures. The lectures you have were from last semester. All the new lectures that are unedited, I just stick them up on my YouTube channel, which is Florida Computer Nerd. Okay, they're all there. They're unedited. So if you want to see this actual lecture, if you want to see this actual lecture in its unedited form, me sitting there chomping on my cereal in the morning, uh, uh, then you can. They're all there, but the lectures from last semester are exactly the same. Uh, and I can't think of anything else to say. Any questions for me? Anything on the chat? The notes or the slides? Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. See, if I don't publish that, thank you for telling me that. Okay. I am so sorry about that because I go through and I look at this and I didn't publish that. And thank you for telling me about that. Okay. If you ever see that, just let me know because that's totally my fault. You should have everything now. You should have lecture notes, PowerPoints, recorded lectures. There were two of them. And then these are all the Pearson slides if you want to look at them. As you can tell, there are a whole bunch of them. And then you can start looking at, I have the video opened. I don't have the slides open, nor do I have the answer sheet, but the answer sheet is just the answer sheet. It's got 70 spaces on it. That's all it is. Is it? It just has 70 spaces on it. Yeah, that's all an answer sheet is. No, I don't want to do that. All righty. Thank you very much. I will see everybody on Wednesday.